last week, too.
It turned around last week? Deal. Yeah.
Study notes?
What?
Not even your own study notes?
Not even your own study notes. No, we are hardcore here. This is how we gave it this morning to all of our seminary students. So we don't cut any slack for you. There's no slack for you. So, all right. Any other questions? We're going to try and do the impossible tonight. It's almost not fair. I admit it's almost not fair to try and do 3 chapters of Daniel tonight, and probably the most difficult chapter, chapter 12. It's almost impossible, but we're going to do it. We're going to tackle it and see how we're going to get. So here's the goal: 15 minutes on chapter 10, an hour on chapter 11, 15 minutes on chapter 12. We're done. Okay? Hold me to it. Someone mark the clocks. Ready? No. No questions. Yeah, honestly, we're going to have to rip through some of this stuff, particularly chapter 11. And I'll tell you when we get to that point. Chapter 11, the first 20 verses, I almost have to just lecture because there's not going to be a lot of discussion unless you are a PhD in ancient Near Eastern, Medo-Persian, and Greek history. Anybody? Not recently. So we're just going to have to kind of rip through it, and I'll hit the highlights there, and we'll go. So let's pray, and we'll jump into this. Lord, thank you for tonight. Thank you for just the privilege of being together again. Thank you for a wonderful semester, and thanks for the many things that we've learned and how we've just seen the incredible truths in this wonderful book. Lord, be our teacher tonight. Let us learn, let us grow, let us see your glory as it's revealed on the pages of Scripture. And Father, we pray that it will promote in us a heart of confidence in your word and trust in you and hope for the future and a belief in your sovereignty over all things. And we pray these things in your name. Amen. All right, chapter 10, let's dive in. We're just going to get right into it. We're on page 180, so I'm just going to, again, hit the highlights. You're going to have to kind of follow along as I go. Okay, keep me on it, Joe. Okay, 17 after. Cut me off and say we're going to chapter 11, all right? All right, so chapter 10, page 180 in your notes. Verse 1 and 2. In the third year, oh, by the way, I need to say that chapters 10, 11, and 12 are one vision. So it really is appropriate to try and do this in one segment because it's one vision, as opposed to previous chapters that were one vision by themselves. This is one vision in 3 chapters. So chapter 10 is the introduction to the vision. Chapter 11 is the content of the vision. Chapter 12 is a few final details on the vision. All right, so that's kind of the structure of these last 3 chapters. Intro, content, and then summing up some details. So chapter 10, verses 1 and 2. In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a message was revealed to Daniel, who was named Belteshazzar. And the message was true and one of great conflict, but he understood the message and had an understanding of the vision. So the first thing we need to note is the vision that you're about to see in chapter 11 is one of great conflict. And one of the things that we're seeing through the book of Daniel is it's going to get worse before it gets better. Remember, the Israelites are in a captivity. They want to know, when's this going to end? And Daniel keeps getting this message, it's going to get worse. And you're going to see it in chapter 11. It's going to get far worse before it gets better, but it will get better. So chapter 10, verse 1, there's this vision that we're going to see of great conflict. In verse 2, in those days, I, Daniel, had been mourning for 3 entire weeks. That's kind of important. Okay, we're going to come back to that in just a minute. He gets this vision. You're not going to find out the details of it until chapter 11, but you need to know that the mourning over the contents of this vision was for Daniel for 3 weeks, 21 days that this took place. So he fasted for those 3 weeks. You can see in verse 3, I did not eat any tasty food, nor did meat or wine enter my mouth, nor did I use any ointment at all, until the entire 3 weeks were completed. By the way, remember in chapter 1, what did he not eat? Meat, and what did he not drink? Wine. But now he's here, he is. He takes a break here for 3 weeks, but he is back to eating meat and drinking wine. So if your Daniel diet doesn't include those things, they can. So, all right. So I don't know about wine. That's between you and the Lord. But, just go eat meat to the glory of God, right? And so he went back at some point. But for 3 weeks, he fasted. And then verse 4 says, "And on the 24th of the first month, while I was at the bank of the great river, that is the Tigris, I lifted my eyes and looked, and behold, there was a certain man dressed in linen, whose waist was girded with a belt of pure gold of Uphaz. His body was like beryl, his face had the appearance of lightning, his eyes were like flaming torches, his arms and feet like the gleam of polished bronze, and the sound of his words like the sound of a tumult. And I, Daniel, alone saw the vision, while the men who were with me did not see the vision. Nevertheless, a great dread fell on them, and they ran away to hide themselves. So I was left alone, and saw this great vision, yet no strength was left in me, and my natural color turned to a deathly pallor, and I retained no strength. But I heard the sound of his words, and as soon as I heard the sound of his words, I fell into a deep sleep on my face, with my face to the ground." Now go to page 182 in your notes. We have to deal with who this individual is. So Daniel he's having a vision, and God is going to reveal this to him, but it tells us here that it's in the form of a man, or a man comes to him. And there's two different views on who this individual is. Either it's a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ, or it's an angel, perhaps Gabriel. And you can see at the bottom of 182 some reasons for why this might be Christ. He has knowledge that above that of angels. He can appear in a vision like a son of man. He's described here as a man in verse 5. So he can appear as a son of man, as he did in Daniel 7. An angel who is actually Christ can appear along with angels, as he did in Genesis 18. Perhaps the most common argument for this being Christ is that it meets the description of Christ in Revelation 1. So come back on January 9, and we'll look at that, but there are some similarities between the descriptions here. And so it's possible that it's Christ. If you turn to the next page, though, there may be some reasons to not take this as Christ. In the middle of 183, perhaps a better view is that it refers to an angel, possibly Gabriel. And the reason for that is likely this individual is the same one who starts talking in just a moment, which we'll look at. Perhaps the greatest reason why is you're going to see in verse 13 that this angel needed help. Does Christ need help?
No.
So for me, that's one of the biggest arguments why I don't think this is Christ. However, perhaps he chose to take help from Michael, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Yeah, Dale.
Also in verse 11, it says, "I am now sent." Would Christ have been sent? I would think Christ would have sent an angel.
Correct.
Rather than having him say, "Well, I am sent."
Correct. I mean, I guess you could say God could have sent him if it is Christ, but it does make more sense that an angel would be sent. Yeah. So you can wrestle through that. I don't think it really matters the interpretation of the passage, but this person begins talking to Daniel and preparing him to receive this vision that we'll see in chapter 11. Now look at chapter 10, verse 10. "Then behold, a hand touched me and set me trembling on my hands and knees. And he said to me, 'O Daniel, man of high esteem, understand the words that I'm about to tell you and stand upright, for I have now been sent to you,'" as Dale just said. "And when he had spoken this word to me, I stood up trembling. And he said to me, 'Do not be afraid, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart on understanding this,'" now watch this, "from the first day that you set your heart on understanding this and on humbling yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come in response to your words." How long has this fast been going on?
3 weeks.
3 weeks. So this angel, or if it is Christ, says in verse 12, "From the day that you set your heart on understanding this and humbling yourself before God," i.e., when you started this fast, "your words were heard, and I have come in response to your words." So 3 weeks ago, this angel begins to try to answer Daniel's interest and questions about this vision. But he doesn't make it for 3 weeks. Why? Verse 13 tells us, "But the prince of the kingdom of Persia was withstanding me for 21 days. Then behold, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I had been left there with the kings of Persia. Who is this?
Satan.
Specifically, what of Satan? His
Demon.
demons.
Demonic.
This is the demonic realm mentioned here. The prince of the kingdom of Persia is likely a reference to demons. And this gives us some little insight into the demonic realm, that they have categories and they have territories, and they're assigned certain places, and there was apparently one assigned over the kingdom of Persia, and this demon or group of demons was withstanding me, meaning this angel on his way to minister to Daniel and help him understand this vision is stopped and prevented from making his way to Daniel for 3 weeks because there's a battle, a conflict that ensues in the heavenly realm between, as it says in verse 13, Michael, the archangel who comes to support and help this angel who was on his way to minister to Daniel. And it says in verse 13 that Michael came to help him, for I had been left there with the kings of Persia. Now, we need to stop just for a moment and think about this. We don't think about spiritual warfare very much, do we? I mean, we just kind of live our lives and we do our own thing down here on earth, and we forget that there is a spiritual realm. And there are angels and there are demons and there are battles being raged in the heavenly spiritual realm that are real and that take place between angels and demons. So here's a little window into what that might look like. Look at the bottom of page 184. Just a couple things to think about here. The last bullet on 184. God has arranged the angelic realm in differing ranks referred to as rule, authority, power, and dominion. Michael and Gabriel have been assigned authority over angels who administer God's affairs for the nation of Israel. In imitation, Satan has also apparently assigned high-ranking demons to positions of authority over each kingdom. So if we believe that God has assigned angels to certain areas and territories, it would make sense that there are also demons who are assigned to certain territories and regions. And this particular demon or group of demons was assigned to the kingdom of Persia, which is the main ruling empire at the time that Daniel's receiving this vision, which tells us something. Where do demons like to focus their power and their energies? In some of the most prominent governments in the world. Why? Greatest impact. You can have the greatest impact if you're amongst the greatest kingdoms and rulers and nations and authorities. And so if they can infiltrate the world kingdom, the ranking world kingdom in that day Persia, maybe in our day US or Russia or China, whatever, they can have a greater impact than if they had influence over the Cameroon government. Not to say anything about Cameroon, but not a world power, right? And so that tells us something a little bit about the ability of Satan and where he focuses his energy. And so just on the bottom of page 185, towards the bottom there, Michael was assigned by God to be Israel's prince and protector. The implications of these statements are clear. Israel has a mighty angelic supporter in the heavenly realm. Therefore, regardless of Israel's political, military, and economic weakness, its existence is assured because no earthly power can resist their great prince. So Michael is assigned to be the protector of the nation of Israel. And so that's one of his roles. It's one of his jobs. And so as these demons were thwarting or involved in this demonic realm, Michael was summoned to give some support to this angel who was in conflict. Top of page 186, there's a couple other things to note. This shows what is taking place behind the scenes all the time. The conflict in the spiritual realm is a perpetual conflict, revealing that a heavenly battle rages continually. The primary power struggles in the universe are not between earthly nations or opposing political parties or world religions. The ultimate power struggle occurs between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of darkness. Okay, this is real. And again, we're not attentive to this, and we're usually not aware of it, but it happens. And so you get a picture of it here. Did anyone read, remember those books, Piercing the Darkness? Remember, what was it, 20, 30 years ago?
Yeah.
Frank Peretti, Piercing the Darkness, and what was the second one? This Present Darkness? Remember those?
Yeah.
I mean, they're fiction, but there's probably some truth to that. And there's probably some elements of accuracy in those books about what's going on in the demonic realm. And I'm not saying we should engage in confronting them, but certainly there is a spiritual realm where that conflict happens. Yeah, Ashley.
I was listening to a testimony from like a person who used to be a Satanist and now he's a pastor, and it just kind of like, yeah, it makes it seem more real, but also like how it makes it seem like realize how important like prayer actually is. Like,
Absolutely.
Of course, yeah. Like yes, it's important even without that, but that also is just like, oh wow, like it's like it's actually going on.
Absolutely.
Prayer is so important.
Yeah, in fact, in light of that, turn over to Ephesians 6 for just a moment. Very quickly, turn over to Ephesians 6, because this touches on exactly what you just mentioned, Ashley. Here's Paul writing to the Ephesians, and this whole section about the armor of God. You remember, you got to put your helmet on, you got to put your breastplate on, you got to put your boots on, you got to put your shield on and your sword. So look at verses 11 and 12 of Ephesians 6. Put on the full armor of God that you may be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. Why? Why should you have your armor on as a believer? For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. You get what he's saying there? You as believers need to have your armor on because you might find yourself in some conflict that there could be a demonic influence there. I'm not saying Christians can be indwelt by demons, by no means, but there is spiritual warfare going on, and you never know what you're going to get caught up in, so you need to have your armor on and be prepared. Joe?
I was going to say C.S. Lewis has the screw tape letters. That's another one.
Yeah. Describes that battle and that conflict. So does that make sense? Okay. Chapter 11, here we go. What happens? So there's this conflict in the heavenlies, and so this angel finally comes, and Daniel, verse 15, he's speechless over this vision. Verse 16, he's in anguish over it. He says at the end of verse 16, I've retained no strength because of what he sees. Verse 17, I have no strength. So this angel then comes to minister to him. Verse 18, he strengthens him. He gives him courage, and he enables him to receive strength. And so all of this is happening in light of this vision. And now we come to the contents, chapter 11. All right? How was that for chapter 10? That was 16 minutes. That was pretty good, right? Okay, chapter 11. Chapter 11, here is the vision then. Here's the contents. Now, this is one of the most phenomenal chapters in the Bible. You have to remember that this is written 400 years before Antiochus. It's written 2,400 years now before the time of Antichrist. And it's written a few years, 10, 20, 30, 40, 100, 130, 150 years before the next set of kings and rulers after Daniel. And the key phrase I'm going to use over and over and over again is, and that's exactly what happened. What you're going to see in this chapter is such accurate, predictive prophecies that you understand now, once you come through chapter 11, why liberals think this has to have been written after the fact. It's so accurate, it's so precise, the details are so specific that either it came after the fact and it was recorded afterwards, or God knows the details ahead of time and records them. So obviously the latter is what we believe. And so this chapter right here should put a death blow to open theism. What's open theism?
God doesn't know what's going on.
God doesn't know the future. Open theism is this belief by certain theologians. It's kind of died down. It was more prevalent 15 years ago. But it was this notion that God doesn't know the future. It was kind of an attempt to get God off the hook when bad things happen to people. And so, the only way you can explain that is just God didn't know. He kind of knows most things, and he knows a lot of things, but there's certain human things that God can't know. He can't factor in every decision that every human is ever going to make. And so, we just can't be certain about those things. So God knows everything. That was a movement within the church. Then chapter will put a blow to that notion. Now, what we're going to do in the first 20 verses is set the stage for getting to Antiochus, and then verses 21 to 35 set the stage for getting to Antichrist. So listen, we're going to move from Daniel in 536 BC all the way up till the time of Antiochus in the 2nd century BC. Then we're going to skip at least 2,000 years now and get to Antichrist. And it's all in one vision. And so it's really an incredible predictive prophecy that is described here. So let me just get into this, and I think you'll see how we just kind of need to rip through some of this. So go to verse 2, page 191. And again, if you don't like history, you're probably going to find this really boring. But what I want you to do is, even if you don't like history, I want you to notice just how omnipotent and wise and omniscient God is. To be able to lay this down with such accuracy. And so, again, if you don't love Medo-Persian and Grecian history, which I frankly don't, but the point of this is God is incredibly wise and sovereign to give us all these details. Okay, so verse 2. Here we go, page 191. And now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings. No, back up, verse 1. Who's in power at this point? Darius the Mede. So Darius the Mede, the first king of the Medo-Persian Empire, he's in power. Verse 2 tells, Daniel's told that there's going to be 3 more kings who arise in Persia. Then a 4th will gain far more riches than all of them. As soon as he becomes strong through his riches, he will arouse the whole empire against the realm of Greece. Now, here's the reason, again, why we need to go through this. Because this is going to set the stage for Israel's persecution. Remember I said it's going to get worse before it gets better. So Daniel's going to trace for us all the events that lead up to the ultimate persecution of Israel, which will then bring about their restoration, which is the ultimate message of the book of Daniel. God's going to restore his people. But he's got to trace this whole line of incredible persecution against the Israelites before he gets to the restoration and the hope that is described in chapter 12. Okay, so verse 2 tells us there's going to be 3 more kings. So there's Darius, and look at the top of 191. There's 3 more kings who followed Darius. First was Cambyses, the son of Cyrus. So first ruler is Darius or Cyrus. Second after him, or the first one of the 3, is Cambyses. Then the second is Pseudo-Smyrtus, then followed by Darius the first, Hystaspes, who was Darius the Great. So those are the 3 kings that followed right after Cyrus. And then verse 2 tells us there's going to be a 4th one who will gain far more riches than all of them. And we know the 4th one in Medo-Persian history is Xerxes. And he reigned from 486 to 465. He was also known as Ahasuerus, and he was the king on the throne in the book of Esther. Remember the whole beauty pageant thing and had her pick a replacement for Queen Vashti? Well, that's this guy. That's Xerxes. That's Ahasuerus. And it says at the end of verse 2 that he would become strong through his riches, which he did, and he would then arouse the whole empire against Greece. And here's our phrase. That's exactly what happened. He attacked Greece, and he went after him. His dad had tried that. Darius the Great had tried that and was unsuccessful. So he tries to attack Greece, and that is also unsuccessful. That's exactly what we find out from history. It didn't go the way he thought. Okay, so there's verse 2. So we move from the Medo-Persian Empire past 3 or 4 kings, and then we come to verse 3. Verse 3 says, "And a mighty king will arise, and he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases." Who was the empire after the Medes and the Persians? Greeks. And who was the greatest king in the Grecian Empire? Alexander the Great. So, and a mighty king, verse 3, will arise, and he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases. And that's exactly what happened. Alexander the Great came and conquered Medo-Persia. He rose to power, and he became, obviously, as we've talked about, an incredible military commander. He was undefeated in battle. He conquered the whole world by the time of age 33, and that's exactly what happened. Verse 3 says it would happen, and it did. So we have seen here the prediction of the dominion of the Medo-Persians, and then followed by the dominion of Greece under Alexander the Great. And then there would be some, page 192, who follow Alexander, and their dominion is described in verse 4. Okay, so you're tracking with me? He's tracing for us all these kings and kingdoms that are going to oppress God's people that lead to the ultimate oppression under Antichrist. So he's just tracing this out for us. Verse 4, "But as soon as he has arisen," as soon as Alexander has arisen, "his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass, though not to his own descendants, nor according to his own authority, which he wielded, for his sovereignty will be uprooted and given to others beside him." What happened to Alexander's empire?
4 divisions.
It was parted out. Remember, there was no one in his line, no successors to take the throne. And so it was predicted that his kingdom would be broken up and parceled out to the 4 points of the compass, and that's exactly what happened. If you look in the notes here, it was parceled out to 4 different kings, 4 generals who became kings over these 4 sectors of the Grecian Empire. So Ptolemy, Seleucus, Cassander, and Lysimachus, and they each ruled a 4th of the Grecian Empire. Now, 2 of those you need to be aware of: Ptolemy and Seleucus. You can see them listed there. You need to remember those guys because they're going to come into play from now until verse 21. Have you heard of the Ptolemies and Seleucids? Part of this Greek empire that was divided up. Well, they become very prominent because right in the middle of your notes, the Ptolemies, or Ptolemy, became known as the king of the south, and Seleucus became known as king of the north. And they're north and south in relation to Israel. So king of the north is the Syrian region, and he's known as Seleucus. He ruled over Babylonia and Mesopotamia and Syria. King of the south, Ptolemy, ruled over Egypt and that whole area south. Now why? Why are those 2 areas important to this vision?
Isn't Israel in between?
Exactly. What's sandwiched right between the area to the north and to the south? It's Israel. And so when these 2 guys and their descendants go to battle, where do they go through? Israel. And where do they fight? In Israel. And who deals with the consequences of that? Israel. So we narrow down from the Persians to the Greeks and Alexander the Great. Then we narrow down into the 4 empires that come out of Alexander. Then we narrow down to 2 of them, Ptolemy, Seleucus, and their successors, because that will bring us to who? 2nd century BC. Antiochus Epiphanes. Remember him? So we're narrowing right into the one who will ultimately bring the greatest persecution against the Jewish people prior to Christ, and he's a forerunner of the one who will bring the ultimate persecution in Antichrist in the future. Okay, so do you see kind of the funnel that's going on here? This is all ahead of time. This is all predicted ahead of time. All right, verse 5. So here's where we go. Now, I think you're just going to have to rip through this with me, and there's constant battles between the north and the south. All right, so the next 15 verses from 5 to 20 describe the constant conflicts going on between these 2 kings that will get us to Antiochus. So verse 5. Then the king of the south will grow strong along with one of his princes who will gain ascendancy over him and obtain dominion. His dominion will be a great dominion indeed. So top of page 193. So Ptolemy is the king of the south. You can see him mentioned, verse 5, he's the king of the south. You can see in verse 6 a reference to the king of the north. So the king of the south is Ptolemy. He ruled over Egypt as the king of the south. And since Seleucid ruled over Syria, which was to the north of Israel, he and his dynasty were referred to as the king of the north. We talked about those being on the outskirts of Israel and why they're important to this vision. So the middle of page 193, the king of the south, verse 5 says, would grow strong. That's exactly what happened. Along with one of his princes who will gain ascendancy over him. And so look at the bottom of page 193. There was a guy by the name of Seleucus who was actually under Ptolemy for a while until he kind of went out and ruled over Babylon. And so he became, as verse 5 says, greater than the one who he started under. So along with one of his princes who will gain ascendancy over him and obtain dominion, his dominion will be a great dominion indeed. So you have Ptolemy, under him is Seleucus. Seleucus goes out and rules over Babylon and actually becomes bigger and stronger than Ptolemy, as predicted in verse 5. And the result at the bottom of page 183 was that Seleucus ruled over far more territory than Ptolemy. Verse 6. Are you still with me? Verse 6, after some years they will form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to carry out a peaceful arrangement. That's exactly what happened. So the king of the south, Ptolemy, died. He was followed by his son Ptolemy II Philadelphus. And Seleucus, who was the king of the north, was murdered. He died. His son Antiochus I Soter became the one who stood on the throne after him. His son, or Seleucus' grandson, Antiochus II Theos, came to rule over Syria in Seleucus' place. So you have Ptolemy II and Antiochus II who are ruling in their respective regions. They hated each other, but they decided to enter into an alliance as described in verse 6. It says they would enter into a peaceful arrangement, but she, who's she? It's the daughter of the king of the south. She was given to the king of the north in kind of this agreement, a pact to enter into this marriage, but she will not retain her position of power, nor will she remain with his power, but she will be given up, along with those who brought her in, and the one who sired her as well as he who supported her in those times. That's exactly what happened. So there's this marriage arranged. Ptolemy's daughter Bernice was given to Antiochus II. In order for that to happen, though, Antiochus II needed to divorce his wife Laodice, which he did in order for the political marriage to take place. So Antiochus II divorces his wife Laodice. They get married, Bernice and Antiochus do, but verse 6 says she will be given up, along with those who brought her in and the ones who sired her as well. So this marriage would not last. It fell apart, and history makes clear that Antiochus II, Theos' former wife, Laodice, was not very happy about being dumped by Antiochus, and so she murders Antiochus by poisoning and had Bernice and their infant son killed, and puts her son, Seleucus II Callinicus, on the throne as king of the north. Sounds like a soap opera, right?
I was just thinking, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is great reading, right?
Palace intrigue.
This is exactly what happened. Verse 7, but one of the descendants of her line, one of the descendants of Bernice's line will arise. So she's murdered, she's killed, but one of her descendants will arise in his place and will come and come against their army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he will deal with them and display great strength. That's exactly what happened. Bernice's family, her brother actually, Ptolemy III Euergetes, did exactly what verse 7 said. He came against the army of the north. He entered the fortress. He killed Laodice, the divorced wife of Antiochus, who killed his sister, and he took the treasure back to Egypt. Exactly as verse 8 says. It says in verse 8 that their gods with their metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold he will take into captivity to Egypt. And that's exactly what happened. Verse 9. Then the latter, will enter the realm of the king of the south, but will return to his own land. So after this humiliating defeat at the hands of Ptolemy III, Seleucus II, Callinicus, the king of the north, invades Egypt, but he's unsuccessful and returns to Syria badly beaten. So do you see what's going on here? King of the north attacks. There's a defeat there. He heads back to Syria. So remember, where are they transgressing, or where are they moving? I mean, where are they walking through? They're always going through Israel. So Israel's in the crosshairs of all these battles between the north and the south.
Israel at that time was much larger than what it is today, right?
Probably a little bit. I mean, yeah.
It included Palestine and all that area.
Correct. But still, yeah, either way, to get through there, you had to travel through that whole region. Verse 10, his sons will mobilize and assemble a multitude of great forces, and one of them will keep on coming and overflow and pass through, that he may again wage war up to his very fortress. That's exactly what happened. Seleucus II, Callinicus' sons, Seleucus III and Antiochus III the Great, continued their war on Egypt, and they did what their father could not do. Seleucus III ruled initially, but he was killed, and so his brother Antiochus III became the ruler in 223 BC, and he did exactly what verse 10 predicted. He brought this war against Egypt, and he was successful, and his army did overflow and pass through a large amount of the land of Egypt. Well, that didn't sit well with the king of the south. See what's going on? Back and forth, back and forth. So verse 11 says, the king of the south will be enraged and will go forth and fight with the king of the north, and then the latter will raise a great multitude, but that multitude will be given into the hand of the former. And that's exactly what happened. Ptolemy Philopator, who was the king of Egypt, didn't want the Syrian army so close, and so he, along with his sister wife Arsinoe, led the Egyptians in battle against Antiochus, the king of the north, and he defeated him, but Antiochus the Great escaped. Verse 12, when the multitude is carried away, his heart will be lifted up, and he will cause tens of thousands to fall, yet he will not prevail. And so that's exactly what happened. Ptolemy slaughtered many thousands of the Syrian army, but his victory would be short-lived. So verse 13, for the king of the north will again raise a greater multitude than the former, and after an interval of some years he will press on with a great army and much equipment. Eventually, Antiochus III the Great would develop a great army again. Antiochus recovered from his devastating loss to Egypt, and 13 years later returned with a much larger army. And the next few verses describe how Antiochus, the king of the north, launched a series of attacks against Egypt. Are you thoroughly bored? It just goes on and on and on, and it's amazing just to watch that this is all so precisely predicted. So what happens in this conflict? Look at verse 14. I have a cold, so excuse me if I'm wiping my nose. Verse 14, now in those times many will rise up against the king of the south. The violent ones among your people will also lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision. So Daniel's told that many will join Antiochus the Great in his battle against the king of the south. And some of them would be Jews. That's the reference there to your people. See, verse 14 talks about your people. Some Jews would join this revolt, and they would go to battle against the king of the south with Antiochus the Great. And some of them will, as verse 14 says, fall down. Some of them would be killed as they go to battle against the king of the south. Verse 15, then the king of the north will come, cast up a siege ramp, and capture a well-fortified city, and the forces of the south will not stand their ground, not even their choicest troops, for there will be no strength to make a stand. And that's exactly what happened. So the king of the north, Antiochus, comes and conquers this great city. He came into Egypt. There was a war at Peneus. Ptolemy sent General Scopas to hold Palestine for Egypt, but Scopas was defeated, and so he fled and hid himself in the city of Sidon. Antiochus chased him down, built a siege ramp, and conquered that city, just as verse 15 says. But he who comes against him, verse 16, will do as he pleases, and no one will be able to withstand him. He will also stay for a time in the beautiful land. What's that? The beautiful land.
Israel.
It's Israel. So Antiochus would be successful in his campaigns, and he would also spend some time in Israel, which again shows Israel at the crosshair of all of these conflicts. Verse 17, he will set his face to come with the power of his whole kingdom, bringing with him a proposal of peace, which he will put into effect. He will also give him the daughter of women to ruin it, but she will not take a stand for him or be on his side. So there's Antiochus, who wants to now try and bring peace between Egypt and Syria, kings of the north and kings of the south. So Antiochus says, let's try and bring some peace. And so he says, we'll give you the daughter of women. So he gave his daughter Cleopatra, actually different Cleopatra than the one you're familiar with, but he gave his daughter Cleopatra to marry Ptolemy V of Egypt, another marriage for political purposes. And this actually didn't work. He actually wanted to give his daughter to the king in order to have a spy in the land. And so he thought if he could get his daughter in his enemy's court, that there could be this kind of inside scoop. Well, she actually fell in love with her husband. And so she turned on her dad. And verse 17 says, he will also give him the daughter of women to ruin it, meaning he thought he could have a woman in there. But, verse 17 says, she will not take a stand for him or be on his side. The whole thing backfired because she was more attached to her Egyptian husband than her father. It's exactly what was prophesied and exactly what happened. Verse 18. He, Antiochus the Great, will turn his face to the coastlands and capture many, but a commander will put a stop to his scorn against him, and moreover, he will repay him for his scorn. So Antiochus the Great, it is said here, would turn his face to the coastlands. He would try to go to war against the regions along the Mediterranean Sea, but it says a commander will put stop to him, which is exactly what happened. The commander here is a Roman by the name of Lucius Cornelius Scipio, who was the brother of Scipio Africanus, who defeated Hannibal. And Scipio was called on by Rome to stop Antiochus, which we did by stopping him in Thermopylae in 191 BC, exactly how verse 18 says it would happen. We're almost at least with this. Verse 19, so he will turn his face against the fortress of his own land, but he will stumble and fall. Antiochus returned to Syria in 188 BC with his tail between the legs. He tried to pillage the temple of Zeus in Elam because he needed money to pay the cost of war, but he was killed there. In his place, verse 20 says, one will arise who will send an oppressor through the jewel of his kingdom. Antiochus the Great had two sons. One of them was Seleucus IV Philopator. The other was a man by the name of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. So it's prophesied that in Alexander the Great, or in Antiochus the Great's place, one will arise who will send an oppressor through the jewel of his kingdom, meaning literally exactor of tribute, one who collects taxes. And so Antiochus the Great's son Seleucus actually heavily taxed his people to make them pay the tribute to Rome. But he, at the end of verse 20, says, would not die in battle. Instead, he was poisoned by his treasurer Heliodorus, who wanted the throne for himself. And who then steps into power after Seleucus Philopator? Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the great persecutor of the Israelites in the 2nd century BC. Okay, so all of that, you made it through some pretty intense stuff there. All of that was to get you to verse 21. The point of all of that was to get you now to the dominion of Antiochus Epiphanes, the one who would be the Antichrist of the Old Testament. And we're going to talk about him next. What are you thinking right now? Any thoughts? Any questions? Any concerns? Rachel?
I'm just wondering, it's so fascinating just seeing like all the points and one after another how they were all happening. But I'm just curious, who was recording all that, like as it was happening outside of Daniel? And like we have such detailed records.
Yeah, we have detailed records of those events.
I mean, who was keeping all these records? I'm just curious. Like,
There's historians. There's people throughout history who have been historians. Herodotus was a historian. Josephus was a Jewish historian, obviously later than this, but There were people throughout those eras who were recording history, and that's how we know how all these things happen. It's been documented. So that's why we know these things are true. This is not just, hey, let's make this up and pretend it happened so we can verify and validate the Bible. No, these things really did happen in history. History corroborates that. It's one of the arguments for the veracity of Scripture. Remember a few weeks ago we talked about how we know the Bible's true? It's true prophetically. It's true scientifically. It's true historically. It's true archaeologically. And it's true personally. So all of those arguments can be used to defend the truthfulness of Scripture. Okay? One of those is historically accurate. Had enough? Because there's more. Verse 21. So we've seen the dominion of Medes and the Persians. We've seen the dominion of Alexander the Great. We've seen the dominion of the four empires that come out of the Alexander the Great. We've seen the wars between the north and the south that ultimately bring us to the dominion of Antiochus Epiphanes. And remember, this is all prophesied ahead of time. So this was 400 years before Antiochus shows up. It's been prophesied that he would show up, and now he's here. And so here's the prophecy about Antiochus Epiphanes. He's traced here and given some incredible prophecies about him. Verse 21 describes him. In his place, a despicable person will arise, on whom the honor of kingship has not been conferred. But he will come in a time of tranquility and seize the kingdom by intrigue. He's called the despicable person. And so Antiochus Epiphanes arises in a time of tranquility, but he seizes the kingdom by intrigue. So back up in the paragraph just before that. Remember, Antiochus the Great has two sons. One of them is Seleucus Philopator. He's killed by his treasurer, Heliodorus. And so technically, the one who should take the throne after Seleucus IV is Seleucus IV's son. Well, he's in Rome. And so Antiochus Epiphanes sees this as an opportunity to, as the end of verse 21 says, take the kingdom by intrigue. And so he usurps the throne. Top of page 199. He is the one who steps in to take the throne that was not rightfully his, and so he takes it. And he is this despicable person, the one on whom the honor of kingship, verse 21 says, has not been conferred. It was not his to take. But he stole it. He stole the throne. And so verse 21, he took it by intrigue, which means slippery places. He used slippery actions. He was deceptive in the way he went about this. And so he steals the throne. And so now he's on the throne. This is about 175 BC. Okay, so we've made it all the way from 536 BC down to 175 BC to Antiochus. Verse 22. The overflowing forces will be flooded away before him and shattered, and also the prince of the covenant. He goes to battle against Egypt like a flood. He destroys them. He destroys the prince of the covenant, probably a reference to the high priest in Jerusalem named Onias. He destroys Onias, kills Onias on his way down to Egypt. Verse 23, after an alliance is made with him, he will practice deception, and he will go up and gain power with a small force of people. Top of page 200. He developed an alliance with the king of Egypt, Ptolemy VI Philometor, but he actually used that as an opportunity to gain power, and so he uses that then to launch a series of attacks against Egypt. Remember how we just talked about how the king of the north went against the king of the south and battles back and forth? Well, Antiochus does the same thing. He goes down and he attacks Egypt. Verse 24, in a time of tranquility, he will enter the richest parts of the realm, and he will accomplish what his fathers never did, nor his ancestors. He will distribute plunder, booty. My kids think that's the best word in the Bible. I don't know why. They just think that's a funny word. And possessions among them, and he will devise his schemes against strongholds, but only for a time. So he goes into Egypt, he enters the richest parts of the realms, and he's this Robin Hood type of figure. He steals all the money from the rich people and gives it to the poor. Why would he do that?
Get their support.
Get their support. He buys their support. He bribes them to essentially supporting him and giving him their loyalty. Yeah, Ashley.
So, like in the Maccabees, is that going on in verse like
We're getting to the Maccabees. Okay. Hang on just a second. It's coming up in just a couple of verses. You'll see it here in just a moment. So we'll come back to it. So he goes into Egypt. He builds favor amongst the poor in his scheme to take over Egypt. Verse 25, he will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south with a large army. So the king of the south will mobilize an extremely large and mighty army for war, but he will not stand, for schemes will be devised against him. Those who eat his choice food will destroy him, and his army will overflow, but many will fall down slain. So Antiochus launches another war with Egypt. He attacks Ptolemy Philometor, and Ptolemy was actually betrayed by his own people. Verse 25 says, or 26 says, there will be some who eat his choice food will destroy him. That means there's some traitors within the Egyptian government. There's some people within Ptolemy's reign who actually went against him. They committed treason, and so that led to Ptolemy's downfall. So Antiochus destroys and conquers Egypt. Verse 27. As for both kings, their hearts will be intent on evil. They will speak lies to each other at the same table, but it will not succeed, for the end is still to come at the appointed time. So there's this battle. They decide to talk and have some terms of peace arranged. Ptolemy's defeated. They put Ptolemy the seventh Euergetes on the throne. Antiochus pretends to want to help this captive king, but in reality he had ulterior motives, and so they enter into this agreement. Verse 27 says, but it will not succeed because their hearts are intent on evil, meaning they enter into this pact that they never intend to keep. Verse 28, then he, Antiochus, will return to his land with much plunder, but his heart will be set against the holy covenant. What's the holy covenant?
The Abrahamic covenant.
Yeah, the Abrahamic covenant, the holy people of Israel. Antiochus, verse 28, says he will return to his land, but his heart will be set against the holy covenant. Here is the first glimpse of Antiochus' hatred against the Jewish people. And you're going to see what he does, and then how the Maccabees, as Ashley said, will revolt against that. We're coming to that. So in verse 28 it says his heart would be set against them. He will take action, meaning he will take action against the Jewish people. We think that it was about this time when he marched against Jerusalem, attacked the city, struck the temple, slaughtered many people in that city. He likely at this time killed 80,000 Jewish men, women, and children and took 40,000 of them prisoners. He robbed the temple of its gold and silver and squelched a Jewish revolt against the high priest Menelaus. Menelaus was the one he put in charge after Onias was slain, and some people arose in a revolt against Menelaus, and Antiochus Epiphanes squashed that revolt, and so he returns to Syria with much plunder. Verse 29. At the appointed time he will return and come into the south, but this last time it will not turn out the way it did before. So remember, he went down to Egypt, he attacked Egypt, he conquered Ptolemy, he's going to come back, he goes back to his land, now he's going to try and do this battle again and conquer more land. But it's not going to turn out the way it did before, and that's exactly what happened. Antiochus launched another series of attacks against Egypt. Verse 30 says, why would it not happen the way before? Because the ships of Kittim will come against him, therefore he will be disheartened and will return and become enraged at the holy covenant and take action. He will come back and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. So he goes to attack Egypt again, bent on destroying them, but this time Rome is on the side of Egypt. Ships of Kittim are likely in cahoots with Rome. They're the Roman ships. And so now Rome is on the side of Egypt. Antiochus launches his attack against Egypt. And Antiochus soon learns that Rome is there to assist Egypt and is not able to conquer. So he returns to his own land, as it says in verse 29, 30. And so what happens? He's mad. He lost. And so on the way back to Syria, he would take out his frustration against Israel along the way. That's exactly what verse 30 said he would do. The ships of Kittim will come against him. He will be disheartened and will return and become enraged at the holy covenant and take action. He's mad. He lost. And he's going to take it out on the holy covenant. He's going to take it out on Israel. And so he does. And this is where we believe that the great abomination of desolation took place. Look over page 202, look at verse 31. Forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice, and they will set up the abomination of desolation. Remember in chapter 8 when we talked about this? What did Antiochus do that desecrated the temple?
Was it pigs brought and then sacrificed pigs on the altar?
Exactly. He sacrificed a pig on the altar. He spread the pig's blood all over the temple. What did he do? Force the pork down the priest's throat. He just committed gross sacrilege against the Jewish people.
Didn't they erect some kind of a statue or something?
He put up an image of Zeus in the temple. And so this happened on December 16, 167 BC. That is the great abomination of desolation. Remember, Jesus, Matthew 24, talks about a future abomination of desolation. So what Antiochus did in 167 BC is going to be duplicated in the future under under Antichrist. So the reason he's here is because Antiochus prefigures Antichrist. Antiochus is a picture of what Antichrist will do and what he'll be like. All right, so verse 32. By smooth words he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant. But the people who know their God will display strength and take action. There's going to be two reactions among the Jews. So Antiochus is there. He's destroying the city. He's committing the abomination of desolation. And some of them will turn out to be traitors. That's what verse 32 says. He will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant. Some of them will actually become traitors to Israel, and they will compromise their beliefs and turn to Antiochus. But, verse 32 says, the people who know their God will display strength and action. There will be some who stand up against him. And actually, this is where the Maccabees come in. There would be some who say, we're not going to stand for Antiochus. We will not stand for his actions. We will not stand for what he's going to do to our people. And so they're going to launch a revolt. I think we talked about this in chapter 8. Verse 33 says, those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many, yet they will fall by sword and by flame, by captivity and by plunder for many days. So there would be some that arise within Israel. And they say, we're not going to do this. It was led by a man by the name of Mattathias, who was the father of 5 sons. One of those sons was named Judas Maccabeus. And he really was the one that kind of launched this revolt. And so they head out into the mountains. They head out into the hills. They say, we're not going to stand for this. We're going to launch kind of this guerrilla warfare attacks against Antiochus. And they did. And so remember we said that the abomination of desolation took place in December of 167 BC. They formed this ragtag band of guerrilla warfare people who eventually launched some counterattacks against Antiochus. In 165 BC, 2 years later, they recapture and cleanse the temple. And remember, we talked about that in chapter 8. That led to what we now know today as the celebration of Hanukkah. Right now, it's what Jews are celebrating right now. Hanukkah is the celebration of the time when the Maccabees did away with Antiochus and regained their temple in 165 BC. Verse 34.
Was Hanukkah observed by the Jews, Jesus' time?
Was Hanukkah observed by the Jews of Jesus' time? I think it was. It was only a couple of hundred years later.
There's no mention of it in the New Testament, is there?
True. Yeah, I don't see much in the New Testament, but they likely continued to celebrate it on up through the time of Christ.
It's on our calendars too.
Yeah, and it's still on calendars here 2,000 years later.
Yeah, I just wondered if it was a celebration that God had really intended as a Jewish feast or Jewish...
Not in the same sense as those Old Testament festivals.
What about Purim?
Purim was not established in the books of Leviticus and Numbers. It wasn't one of those.
It hasn't happened yet.
But yeah, it happened after Esther,
Right.
was used by the Lord to preserve his people. So Purim was a celebration of God's deliverance of his people after Esther. Yeah. Verse 34. Now when they fall, meaning some of them would be killed, some of the Maccabeans would be killed in this revolt, when they fall, they will be granted a little help, and many will join them in hypocrisy. Actually, some of them would start the Maccabean revolt and be with it, but only turn later to be traitors. And that's exactly what happened. There were leaders, John Hyrcanus and Alexander Jannaeus, who actually turned to be hypocrites within that Maccabean revolt, prophesied here in verse 34. Verse 35, some of those who have insight will fall in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the end time, because it is still to come at the appointed time. That brings us through Antiochus. So, Daniel's in captivity. He wants to know, when is this going to get better for the Jewish people? And he's just heard a vision of there's going to be 3 Medo-Persian kings, actually a 4th. Then there's going to be Alexander the Great. Then there's going to be 4 kingdoms divided into 2 main ones, north and the south. One of those, the north, is going to give the people a ruler by the name of Antiochus, who will do severe damage and persecution and oppression to the Jewish people. How much worse can it get? Much worse. So starting in verse 36, we move into Antichrist.
So there's no mention of Rome in Daniel then?
No mention of Rome?
The Roman Empire?
Not here.
Okay.
There was back in chapters 2 and 7.
Yeah, not a great detail though.
Yeah. Yeah, remember the Roman Empire was that 4th kingdom, that 4th beast, right. But they're not really referred to here. So he skips. Yeah, that's a good point, Terry. So we skip from Antiochus Epiphanes, who came out of the Syrian part of the Grecian Empire. We skip from him now between verse 35 and verse 36. We move from the 2nd century BC all the way to the future, whenever that happens, whenever Antichrist comes. So between verses 35 and 36, you have now a 2,200 year gap, at least, growing every day. All right? Rachel, what were you going to say?
Oh, writing that down. So I just heard you say Antiochus Epiphanes, he came out of the Grecian Empire?
Well, he came out of one of the divisions. So remember, Alexander the Great's empire was divided into 4 separate regions. One of those regions was the Seleucian region in the north, and he came out of that line. So it was all kind of part of the Grecian Empire, but he came out of the Syrian line or the Seleucian line of that Greek Empire.
So he wasn't a Jew, but he just wasn't a Jew, though.
He was not a Jew.
So verse says that he will others, and he take action and then return to his own land.
Yeah.
So if we're talking about Antiochus,
correct.
He wasn't a Jew. Why is he saying it's his land?
His land meaning Syria.
Oh, I thought we were talking about Israel in that verse.
He's on his way back.
He's on his way back. So the Holy Covenant is referring to Israel. He's on his way back from war with the Egyptians. He passes through the Holy Covenant, the Israelite land, on the way back to his land, the land of Syria.
Okay.
It's confusing, I understand.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not Israel. He's not an Israelite. He's a...
So did Israel belong to either north or south rulers?
Who?
Israel.
Did it belong to either the kings of the north or the...
Yeah, it was being
controlled at the north, and they were times controlled by kings of the south. So it went kind of back and forth. That was the purpose of including all of the battles between the king and the north, because at times Israel belonged to both of those kingdoms as the wars raged between them. Tim?
It was probably like when whichever kingdom was traveling through to fight the other.
Yeah.
They had to get all their supplies, animals,
chaotic.
all the crops and all that, because it takes a lot for it.
Yeah, I mean, just think about World War II. As the Allies marched through France and as they marched through the Netherlands, and I mean, what happened to those places it was devastated, right? Just by the whole era and aura of war.
The South and Civil War too.
Civil War, same thing.
You always think of Greece as this place over there, not too far from Rome, where they have all these beautiful buildings and the philosophers and all this stuff. But Empire was way over to the east of that.
After it was divided, yeah. Well, yeah, even the existing Grecian Empire was all the way to the east of that. You're correct. Yep.
But none of the rulers were in Greece itself. They were all.
Well, Alexander was.
Yeah, he was, but
Yep. After that, it was divided into those 4 parts.
so nobody was really ruling in Greece itself.
Well, I think one of them was. I can't remember which one was. Cassander or Lysimachus. They kind of all. There was overlap there.
So they just sat back and watched these other guys do.
Yeah, right. Glad we're not involved in that, right? All right. Verse 36. We now move to Antichrist. Remember I said there's a gap between verse 35 and 36. So verse 35 ends with Antiochus Epiphanes. We now move to verse 36 to 45, where, as I said, it's going to get far worse for Israel under Antichrist. Now go to the next... Well, go to page 204. Here's just a little picture or diagram of the events of the tribulation period, just to kind of give you a picture. Now, we believe Antichrist obviously is still future. He hasn't done what he's going to do yet. So here's a little diagram that shows you what that's going to look like. So Antichrist is first head of the Western nations. He makes a compact or a treaty with Israel to protect them. He then breaks that covenant at the abomination of desolation. Remember what Antiochus Epiphanes did in sacrificing the pig in the altar? That's going to be a picture of some sort of sacrilege that Antichrist is going to commit as well. Probably the midpoint of the tribulation, he will commit the abomination of desolation. He then breaks his covenant with Israel and turns on them. So instead of protecting them, he persecutes them for the second half of the tribulation. He then is the world ruler during that time. And you can see when we think those different judgments occur. Seal judgments, trumpet judgments, bowl judgments. It gets progressively worse as you progress through the tribulation, with the worst bowl judgments occurring right at the end, right around the time of Battle of Armageddon. Okay, so just as it's progressing, it's getting worse and worse and worse. And so that's what's going to be described here in verses 36 to 45. Now, go to the page 205. There's a little diagram of the career of the Antichrist. We believe he's going to rise to power. The midpoint of the tribulation, he's killed, or he either fakes his death or is killed. He's raised back to life, and then he becomes the dictator of all the nations on the earth. Now, back to Daniel chapter 11. Some people think that when you come to verse 36, Antiochus is still in view here. And they would say, well, you move from verse 35 right into verse 36. There doesn't seem to be a gap there. How do you know you're changing from Antiochus to Antichrist starting in verse 36? And I gave you some reasons toward the top of page 205. There's a little phrase at the end of verse 35 that says, until the end. You see that in verse 35? Until the end time. I think that sets us up for Antichrist. So that little phrase, until the end time, there's kind of a time marker there for us, telling us that perhaps what is coming next leads us into the end time. Then, if you look over in chapter 12, verse 1, the very events described there. Now at that time, what's going to happen? There will be a time of great distress, verse 1 of chapter 12. Immediately after that, verse 2 says there's going to be a resurrection. When does the resurrection happen?
In judgment seat.
Yeah, what's going to happen at the time of Christ's return for the Old Testament saints and the tribulation saints. So if there's a time sequence here that immediately following the events described at the end of chapter 11, we have to be then referring to Antichrist here at the end of chapter 11, not Antiochus. So this has to be future events. And thirdly, the events described at the end of chapter 11 don't coincide with what Antiochus did. It describes what Antichrist did. So it doesn't fit what is known about Antiochus. So all that just to say, we believe that we move from verse 35, speaking of Antiochus, into verse 36, and the end of the chapter speaking of Antichrist. And what I want you to notice in verses 36 to 45 then is just some characteristics of Antichrist. Again, we don't have time to go through each one of these, and we've hit these already quite often in chapter 7 and chapter 8. But just notice what Antichrist is going to be like. Verse 36, he will do as he pleases. He's going to be self-willed. And he will exalt and magnify himself above every god and will speak monstrous things against the God of gods. So he's going to be arrogant. He's going to be proud. He's going to be boastful. He's going to be blasphemous in that he speaks monstrous things against the God of gods. And he will prosper until the indignation is finished, meaning he's going to have his way until God decrees this thing to stop. Okay, so you just get to see a picture into what Antichrist is going to be like. Self-willed, arrogant, boastful, blasphemous against the true God, the King of kings and Lord of lords. Page 206. What else do we learn about him? Verse 37. He will show no regard for the gods of his fathers or for the desire of women. Some people think that the gods of the fathers there indicates he's Jewish, because that phrase, gods of his fathers, is often used in the Old Testament to refer to Jewish people, the gods of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. So some people think that that's a reference to the fact that he is Jewish. But I don't think that's the case at all. He will not be Jewish. He's going to come out of a revived Roman Empire. So the gods of his fathers here, top of page 207, must refer to the fact that he will have no respect for his religious heritage. So he's not going to respect any religious heritage of whatever people group he comes out of, likely Rome, and he will reject their religious practices as well. So he's going to completely reject all religious practices. Why? Because he wants to set himself up as the one to be worshipped.
The epitome of secular humanism.
Exactly.
Where self is God.
Exactly. That's exactly right. He's going to set himself up as God, which is, as Gay says, secular humanism. So he's going to reject not only Christianity, he's going to reject any other religious systems as well, because he doesn't want any competition. Ashley?
Do you think that, like, and I can't say his name,
Antiochus?
Yeah, there we go, sorry. So, like, he made the Jewish people, like, forsake the, like, God's law and, like, his, like, will for us to live. So do you think that, like, the Antichrist, like, that'll be a parallel?
Yeah.
Like, what the Antichrist will be?
Yeah, so Antiochus, remember, set up that image of Zeus in the temple. He wanted people to worship a false god. Similar to secular humanism. He wanted them to reject the God of Israel, and certainly Antichrist is going to do the very thing. He's going to take down anyone who worships the true and living God in any other religious system as well, because he wants it all for himself. Epitome of arrogance and pride. Verse 37 says he will also show no regard for the desire of women. What does that mean?
Gay.
Could be.
Well, not, I mean, yeah.
He could be a homosexual.
Could be.
It is possible that, and that's some commentators' belief, is that he will be a homosexual. Other, perhaps, interpretation of that is that he will not possess the desired characteristics that most women desire. That sounds a little weird, but you understand, women want a man who's kind and gracious and compassionate, and Antichrist isn't going to really be that. So it's possible that's what it means. Here's what I think it actually means, though. I think this is a reference to Christ. He's going to have no regard for the desire of women. So how does that relate to Christ? What was the desire of every young Jewish girl in the Old Testament?
To be the mother of the Messiah.
To be the mother of Messiah. The desire of women in the Old Testament was to be the mother of Christ. So it's possible that this is a reference to the fact that he has no regard for Christ. Antiochus was not a homosexual, and so that may show us that Antichrist will not be as well. Whatever you translate that is, certainly he's going to reject Christ. He's also going to have complete disregard for morality, which we'll see more in just a moment. Okay, verse 38. But instead he will honor a God of fortresses. Instead of honoring the God of his fathers, verse 37, he's going to instead honor a God of fortresses. What's that a reference to?
Military might.
Military might. He is going to be a military genius. He is going to have a massive army. So this God of fortresses here is a reference to his army. He's going to honor a God of fortresses, a God whom his fathers did not know, and he will honor him with gold, silver, costly stones, and treasures, meaning he's going to pour tons and tons and tons of money into a military. So he's going to have a massive defense budget. And so he's going to build this massive war machine. What's he going to do with it? Verse 39, he's going to take action against the strongest of fortresses with the help of a foreign god. What's the foreign god here? The foreign god is the god of his fortresses. So he's going to destroy other kings and kingdoms with his own military power and military might. And he will give great honor to those who acknowledge him and will cause them to rule over the many and will parcel out land at a price, meaning he's going to reward people with land who vow their allegiance to him. He's going to bribe them. He says, you come along with me, you worship me, you get on my side, I'm going to give you land to keep you. That's what Antichrist will be like. Verse 40. At the end of time, the king of the south will collide with him, and the king of the north will storm against him with chariots, with horsemen, and with many ships, and he will enter countries and overflow them and pass through. There is going to be a massive conflict that he will engage in as he begins to take power and take over the world, and there will be battles that are fought. This is not reference here to Armageddon yet, because Armageddon is fought between Antichrist and his ruler and his armies against Christ. This is still the battles that he's waging as he tries to take over the world. Okay, so there's a textual issue there that you can read about, whether there's 2 kings or 3 kings in view there.
Is that the Gog and Magog reference?
No.
Some people think this is Gog and Magog. There may be some good arguments why Ezekiel 38 and 39, where it talks about Gog and Magog, actually refers to the battle that takes place at the end of the millennium. Remember, there's one final battle at the end of the millennium. And so that may be a reference to Gog and Magog there. Yeah, Teresa.
Horses and chariots? Why horses and chariots at this time in history?
Good question. So why horses and chariots? Verse 40. I think the answer would be in that day, that's all they could conceive of in terms of military weaponry, right? They didn't have an F-16 or an Abrams tank. They only had horses and chariots, and so I think the reference here is an imagery that they would have understood in terms of a war machine. And, yeah. Okay, skip over a couple pages to verse 41. He will also enter the beautiful land, page 210, and many countries will fall. Remember the kings of the north and the kings of the south, how they went through the beautiful land? Went through Israel, they went through Palestine, they destroyed it, they hurt it, they persecuted it, they oppressed it. It's exactly what Antichrist is going to do. He's going to enter the beautiful land, and many countries will fall, but these will be rescued out of his hand. For some reason, Edom, Moab, and Ammon will not come under his control. We're not quite sure why. It could be because they're already on his side, or their land is not in the area where he's concerned about, but whatever reason, they won't be conquered. Verse 42, he will stretch out his hand against other countries, and the land of Egypt will not escape. He's going to continue waging war, and he will take over countries. Verse 43, he will gain control over the hidden treasures of gold and silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. What could that be a reference to? Precious things in Egypt.
Oh, stuff in the pyramids.
Could be. Oil reserves? It could possibly be he's going to have control over the oil reserves in the Middle East. Again, speculating. But he's going to gain control over hidden treasures, gold and silver, and over all precious things of Egypt. So just imagine, if he controls oil, you control the world. Right? Verse 44, rumors from the east and the north will disturb him. He will go forth, and great wrath will destroy and annihilate many. He's going to go off to more battles in the other regions. Verse 45, now watch this. He will pitch his tents of his royal pavilion between the seas. What two seas are referenced here?
The Med and the Dead.
The Med and the Dead. Mediterranean Sea and the Dead Sea. He's going to pitch his tents between them and the beautiful holy mountain. What's that?
Zion, Jerusalem.
Mount Zion in Jerusalem. And yet he will come to his end and no one will help him. So where does he put his headquarters when he's doing all of this? Right in Israel. So do you understand why he's going to persecute and oppress them so horribly? He's going to launch his campaigns from Israel. And so you can see what's going to happen. Now how does this end? Verse 45. No one will help him. He will come to his end. There's a glimmer of hope. Put yourself in Daniel's shoes. Put yourself in the Jewish people's shoes. And you're hearing one thing after the other. Worse, 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 worse. Oh, but he's going to come to his end. Chapter 12 is going to tell us how it all ends. Quick question, Terry?
Yeah. You're saying there that he's going to establish his rule in Jerusalem, but so what in Revelation, what's Babylon? I thought that was the area that the Antichrist would be ruling from.
Revelation 18, in reference to Babylon, probably refers to the apostate world system. It's probably not a place. It's probably more of a reference to...
Not the Babylon of the Old Testament.
Yeah. Come back next semester and we'll tackle that. All right, so there's a glimmer of hope at the end of chapter 11. He's going to be killed. We know how it's going to happen. Revelation 19, he's going to come. Christ is going to come back. He's going to come in his second coming on a white horse with armies. And if you're in Christ, you will come back with him and you'll be clothed in white. And you get to engage in a battle where there will be no weapons. Because how does Christ destroy the Antichrist? With his word. If he can create the universe and everything in it with a word, he can destroy Antichrist with a word, and he will. So there's going to be this final battle. Antichrist is going to be destroyed. Now turn over to chapter 12. Let's get to the good news. Page 213, the bottom of 213. Now at that time, at what time? At the time all of this is raging with Antichrist, at that time, Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of your people, he's the protector of the nation of Israel. He will arise, and there will be a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. And at that time, your people, everyone who is found written in the book, will be rescued. Read that through the lens of an Israelite still captive in Babylon. Does that give you some hope? There's going to be this horrible time of distress. This has never happened in the history of the world. Notice what it says, since there was a nation. The greatest distress upon this earth, since there was the formation of a nation, will occur at that time under Antichrist, known as the Great Tribulation. Pages 214, 215 deal with what that time period is going to be like. We'll skip over that. We'll get to that next semester. Go to page 216. What's going to happen? Well, at the end of verse 1 says that they are going to be rescued. They're going to be delivered. They're going to be saved. They're going to be freed from Antichrist rule and power. And the top of 216 says that we believe Zechariah 13 talks about how 2/3 of them are going to die in the tribulation, and a remaining 1/3 of them will still be alive at the end of the tribulation. So 2/3 of Israel is killed in the tribulation. 1/3 survives, and we think the 1/3 that survives probably constitutes redeemed Israel. So not only are they saved physically, they're saved spiritually. And they constitute then this redeemed entity that enters into the millennial kingdom. When God says in Romans 11 that all Israel will be saved, we think this is what it's referring to. The people who survive the tribulation, the Jewish people, are saved physically and spiritually, and they become now this remnant that makes up the restored nation of Israel. They're rescued, the end of verse 1 says. So hope number 1 is a rescue. Here's hope number 2. Verse 2. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, but the others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. Hope number 2 is a resurrection. So there's the hope of this rescue, then there's this hope of this resurrection. Why is that important? Because what happens if you're a believing Jew and you die in the tribulation? What's the question that's going through Daniel's mind? What's going to happen to them? They go through all of this, and they survive for some of it, and then they're killed by Antichrist, and they're martyred. What happens to them? What about them? Do they miss out? Verse 2 says, not a chance. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground, that's a euphemism for death. Many of those who are killed in the tribulation, they will be resurrected to everlasting life, but the others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. 2 resurrections described there. This is one of the best references in the Old Testament. 2 of them, a resurrection of and a resurrection of wicked. Turn over to page 217. Look at the chart there. And there are different kinds of resurrections. There's 2 kinds of resurrections. There's a resurrection of the righteous, and there's a resurrection of the unsaved. And when do those happen? Just look at, there's different, it's not so much an order, not the first in order and second in order. It's more first and second in kind. There's a first kind of resurrection, which is the resurrection of all the saved, and then there's a resurrection of the unsaved. And when does the first resurrection occur? Well, there was one at the cross when Christ was raised from the dead. There will be one at the rapture when believers are raptured and resurrected and given new bodies. And there is one that occurs at the end of the tribulation, an Old Testament tribulation. So when the Old Testament tribulation say about body at the second coming, that's what Daniel 2 says, or 12:2 says, that they will receive their resurrected bodies at the second coming of Jesus Christ. Verse 2 then also describes another resurrection, others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. That's a resurrection of all the wicked. When's the resurrection of all the wicked? Now Daniel wouldn't have known this, but there's 1,000 years between these 2 resurrections. There's 1,000 years that between the last of the first resurrection and the resurrection of all unsaved people. They will be resurrected to life at the end of the millennial kingdom to face the great white throne judgment. So think about this. If you're a believer, church age saint, Old Testament saint, tribulation saint, you will be resurrected someday and given a new body fit perfectly for heaven. And the wicked are also raised back to life at the end of the millennial kingdom and given bodies specifically fit for hell, to endure the torments of hell forever. It's not something we think about. We think about our resurrection, but there's also a coming resurrection for the wicked when they will have to stand in the great white throne judgment. So hope number 1 is a rescue. Hope number 2 is a resurrection. Hope number 3, verse 3. Then those who have insight, page 218, those who have insight will shine brightly like the brightness of the expanse of heaven, and those who lead the many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. What's the hope of Israel? There's coming a day when they'll be rescued, when they'll be resurrected, and they will shine forth the glory of God. And they will be a redeemed people, saved by God. So do you see how this message spans from the time of Daniel all the way to the future coming kingdom of Christ? It's tremendous. There's a few more things. Real quickly, we'll end with this. Page 221, verse 11 and 12 says there's going to be a few extra days. I want to touch base real quick on this. From the time the regular sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. How blessed is he who keeps waiting and attains to the 1,335 days. How long is the second half of the tribulation in days? What's 3.5 years in 1,260 days? That's 3.5 years. But there's going to be 1,290 days and 1,235 days, an extra 30 days, and then an extra 45 days. And we think that that 75-day extension occurs between the end of the Great Tribulation and the beginning of the millennial kingdom. 30 days, perhaps, for the sheep and goat judgment to occur, and then another 45 days, perhaps, for Christ to set up his kingdom, set up the government that will lead into his millennial kingdom. And that's the book of Daniel. John.
Gotta ask, can't help but be intrigued with verse,
You need to go grab your kids, you can go grab your kids. If you need to go, you can go. Go ahead.
verse 4.
Oh, conceal these words and seal up the book?
The context at the beginning of the chapter is tribulation in tone, and then there's this abrupt enough. As for you, Daniel, conceal these words and seal up the book until the end time.
Yep.
I can't help but be intrigued about that and the seals in Revelation.
Yeah. They could be related.
Because when the seals are, that unfolds the whole tribulation judgments.
Exactly. And where are the people in the tribulation going to look for answers to what's going on? I think he's saying you're going to seal it up and it's going to be read again someday in the future. It may be related to the seals as well, but I think it's also related to the fact that this book is going to be opened again and they're going to read it in the end times to figure out what's going on.
It just seems to fit.
Yeah, it does. Guys, thanks for sticking with this really fast survey. See you January 9, Book of Revelation. Thanks.
Good. Who were the Jews that only believed in the first 5 books? Sadducees. Yeah. So they would just blow all this whole stuff off, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
And the resurrection, they wouldn't believe Daniel. I mean, they wouldn't read Daniel. It's not part of the Pentateuch, whatever.
That really is it.
Yep.
At what point in the tribulation do the Jews accept Christ? Acknowledge Him.
I thought this.
So they can be saved under Jewish law then if they're killed during the tribulation?
Well, they can be saved by the gospel, not the Jewish.
But then they would be accepted in Christ throughout the tribulation.
Zechariah 12 says, when look on Him whom they have pierced, they will mourn.
So if they die as a Jew, they're lost during tribulation. If they die as a, or will God call all the Jews to repentance?
He will call the elect Jews to repentance.
Some that won't be.
Okay. Because when he says
What do you think, Wayne? That was okay until talk for the election. I'm not being sarcastic, but I just don't agree with all the just struggle with that. Whether it's for Jews, Christians, or whomever. Billions and billions of people in this world, and yet so we say millions. I don't know. You know, you ever watch these old Greek and Roman movies? I mean, I'm not into them. I don't watch them a lot, but you see scenes of it, you know, fight.